right. So, for those of you watching this on the recording, which as you can see, is probably going to be all of you, um, I'm just going to be lecturing. If people show up, they show up. If they don't, they don't. Day job got a little hectic yesterday, so I had to push this off until Tuesday night. Um, but that's okay because I got a good amount of material to cover here, and I think we're going to be able to get through it fairly quickly, but hopefully not make it too dense, too fast. What we're talking about tonight is the history of modern magic, and the dates I picked for this are 1854 to 1992. There's two bookend events there that really delineate this really more like a 150-year period rather than 138 or whatever that works out to period. And what do I mean by modern magic? So there, in the old days prior to the 19th century, let's say back all the way back to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, ritual magic it was a thing, but not really a thing. There was a lot of talking about it, a lot of writing about it, but doing it was a little bit different. There were, and of course, then you have the Middle Ages, so medieval magic, but modern magic, by which I mean pretty much everything everybody does. If it didn't originate in this time period of the mid 19th century, we tend to all see it through the lens of the 19th century. A lot of the assumptions, the language we use, comes to us from this time period where for the first time all of these various disparate ideas from all over the world all sort of came together and crystallized into what we now call modern magic. So let's plow right in, shall we? So the first big guy you need to know, big name, and this is the biggest name of everyone we're going to talk about tonight. Bigger than Mathers, who was the founder of the Golden Dawn, bigger than Crowley, bigger than Peter J. Carroll, bigger than Anton LaVey. You cannot overstate the effect that this man had on magical theory and practice. His name was D.F.S, which was not his real name. It's believed that that's I don't really know this for certain, but it is believed that this was Eliphas Levi happened to be an anagram of his real name, but it doesn't really matter. He lived from 1810 to 1875. He was French. He was a Freemason, and Freemason forms a lot of the backdrop of what's going on in this era. So Freemasonry as a thing, defined thing, at this point has existed for about 100 years. It started to show up in the 18th century, mid 18th century. Their legends, of course, their mythology places it far further back than that. That they're the descendants of the Knights Templar, yada, yada, yada. And Eliphas Levi wrote a lot of books. In fact, he wrote a book on the history of magic. But the one for which he is most known, and the one that is the atomic bomb that completely changed everything, was a book that in French, and my French pronunciation is awful, so bear with me. Dogma et Rituel de la Haute Magie, which translates to Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. It was released in 2 volumes, Dogma in 1854 and Ritual in 1856. Most people in the English-speaking world, which is really all I'm concerned with here because I don't know much about the magic of other language-speaking places, comes to us from Arthur Edward Waite, a translation of Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. Arthur Edward Waite was a member of the Golden Dawn. He is the Waite behind the Rider-Waite tarot deck. And he translated it as Transcendental Magic, Its Doctrine and Ritual in 1896. There was a revised edition in 1923. That's probably the one, if you're only able to find one translation, it's probably going to be that one. And I believe it's public domain now. But the excellent ceremonial magician, John Michael Greer, did a more recent translation, The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, a new translation, in 2017. Now, both of these books are very long, and very detailed, and there's a lot going on. But the main ideas that Eliphas Levi contributed was he took the tarot, astrology, and Kabbalah, and combined them. So he's kind of the guy that defined. Well, he is the guy who first defined that the various pieces of the Tree of Life in the Kabbalah correspond to cards in the tarot deck. So these spheres, from Kether at the top, Malkuth at the bottom, which you'll remember from our Kabbalistic Cross exercise 2 weeks ago. So 10 spheres, those correspond to the aces through the tens of the suits. And there's 4 suits, and how that works out is a little more complicated than what we're going to cover here. But you basically have the aces at the top, tens at the bottom. And then the paths that connect the spheres are the major arcana. With the Fool, including the Fool at the top, all the way down to the World at the bottom. This then, because Kabbalah was already associated with astrology, allowed a sort of a second degree association of tarot to astrology that would find full fruition later with the work of Aleister Crowley. The 2 most famous things you've probably heard of from this book are, if you just Google Baphomet, this picture is going to show up, and that picture is directly from Eliphas Levi. Only it's not Baphomet. in his actual work, he labels it as the Sabbatic goat, and it's a symbol of transcendence. One hand up, one hand down, Salve and Coagula, which means to separate dissolve, and then coagula is reconstitute. So analysis and synthesis is another way of saying it. It's a really good way of saying it. So you're breaking things apart, putting it back together. It's both male and female. It's man and animal. It's mammal and reptile. Um, it the sun and the moon. So it is the ultimate transcendent form of the, and he labeled it the goat of the witch's Sabbath. Now, Baphomet is, nobody's really sure, but I tend to go with the fairly well supported idea that Baphomet is a bastardized French mispronunciation of the name Mohammed. And when the Knights Templar were banned and suppressed by the church and the state, and make no mistake, the Pope banned the Knights Templar at the behest of the King of France, because the Knights Templar had more money and more power than he did. And he wanted their money, and he wanted their land. And a lot of the stories about what the Templars were up to, hey, welcome. I'm kind of in the middle, but that's okay. We just got up to the Knights Templar part. The Templars were so tortured by the Inquisition that they literally would have confessed to anything, and did confess to anything. Talking about the origin of Baphomet here in our first author, which is Eliphas Levi. What sounds like happened historically, actually, is the Templars were so tortured and whacked out of their mind that they just started babbling about the only other religion that they knew anything about, which was Islam, because they were crusaders. And somehow, and nobody's really sure when or how or where or who, that illustration Eliphas Levi did of the Sabbatic goat got associated with Baphomet. And that's why when you think of Baphomet, that's what you think of, is Eliphas Levi's Sabbatic goat. Now, the good news is you're just in time for when it gets really interesting. A few decades after Levi wrote his book, this thing went off, and the book I'm referring to here is The Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. That thing went off like an atom bomb, and it changed the way everybody thought about magic at the time, which most people didn't think about magic at the time, really. But it circulated around through Masonic circles on the continent and in England. And 30 years or so later, a group of Freemasons, the most critical of which was S.L. McGregor Mathers, Samuel Little McGregor Mathers. McGregor was not actually his name. Legally, he didn't have that name. He just appropriated that name so that he could say that he was descended from a clan of Scottish nobility. The reality is he wasn't at all Scottish. Yeah, McGregor Mathers was, he liked to spin a tall tale. And his tall tale was that this old lady in Germany had slipped him this cipher text that they called the cipher manuscripts, or Z documents, which are the decrypted version of the cipher manuscripts. I don't know that anyone's actually seen the actual cipher manuscripts, or if they ever actually existed. But Mathers supposedly received this, puzzled around with it for a long time, and was finally able to crack the code and realized that what this was a collection of documents, secret documents, detailing the rituals and structure of a Rosicrucian order in Germany. Um, in reality, what they were was a bunch of really interesting stuff that Mathers cribbed together from his own reading, largely of Levi and then also of John Dee. Later, cobbled together and turned into a practical system of magic, and also a structure, a curriculum for teaching magic to people, that they then constituted in two orders. One was a Rosicrucian order, the RR et AC, the which is Latin for the Red Rose and Golden Cross, basically. Um, and then that was the inner order, the secret order, and then there was the outer order, which they called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Um, and for people listening to this on video, I'm sorry my fan is spinning up right now, but this is the only microphone I have currently. Um, so what the Golden Dawn did was they took all of this stuff that Levi had synthesized from disparate pieces of Western esotericism. So they took that theoretical basis and that ritual structure framework that he had, the basic rituals that he had, and turned it into a what's called a paramasonic order. So basically, it had the same degree structure. You had two orders with 3 degrees in each order. It's very similar to how the Masons are. And turned it into a very systematic, very effective form of ritual magic that was in the right place at the right time in Victorian England, and attracted all of the well-heeled and wealthy, of a certain frame of mind, became members of the Golden Dawn, to the extent that the poet Yeats was a member. Ode to a Grecian Urn. There were some rather famous people of the time in it. It was kind of like Scientology of the day in Victorian England. There were celebrities, and it was generating a lot of buzz. And are they a cult? Are they this, that, or the other? And there were these salacious newspaper stories and drama and all sorts of fun stuff. Within a couple of decades, the whole thing had collapsed in on itself because of the drama. There were a couple of incidents. Basically, the biggest one was the founding members got in a fight with each other, and each of them kind of went their separate ways, as did some guys too, like Arthur Edward Waite of Tarot Deck fame, who translated, as I mentioned earlier, did the first translation into English of Dogma of Eliphas Levi. Basically, a bunch of adepts and leaders of the group went their separate ways, and each started their own. We're the real Golden Dawn. And the thing that finally precipitated the final collapse of it was MacGregor Mathers came across a young student of the Mysteries who Mathers correctly identified as an absolute prodigy. Just out of university, he went to Oxford. He was still young, but very accomplished mountain climber, adventurer, who was also extremely libertine with his sexual morals, even by today's standards, let alone the standards of Victorian England. Mathers, because this young man was so magically talented, Mathers went so far as to basically allow him to skip all of the Golden Dawn degrees and just made him an adept so that he could give him essentially everything, the keys to the kingdom. The others in London, the more conservative members in London, and especially William Butler Yeats, hated this kid and hated everything he stood for, and basically kicked Mathers out, saying you didn't correctly make him an adept. And Mathers' argument was, I defined all of these rituals and standards. What do you mean I didn't correctly do it? I'm the one who says what's correct. So the Golden Dawn completely collapsed in on itself. At this point, it's worth mentioning that a lot of the adepts who went their separate ways ended up creating magical orders that would then cross-pollinate. Dion Fortune, good example. But a big one was a man by the name of Gardner, who took then, many years later, he was a young man when it fell apart, but once he was older, he took a lot of the Golden Dawn structure and rituals, really simplified them a lot for a more general audience, combined them with ideas coming from what was sort of a precursor of neo-paganism, which was neo-druidism in the UK at the time, and created a new religion out of it called Wicca. Now, I'm not going to talk about Wicca a lot because Wicca is a religion that has magic sort of off to the side, but Wicca's focus is primarily as a religion, not a magical path. Although, after Gardner, it fragmented and changed and remixed, and as these things always do. But, of course, the person who is most well known of these adepts and refugees from the Golden Dawn, the young man who was the center of the controversy that blew the whole thing up, was a young man by the name of Alistair Edward Crowley. And Crowley, after the Golden Dawn detonated, knocked around for a couple of decades. Still practiced magic, but not much. Until several decades later, well, not several, a few, he gets married. And while his wife and he gets married to Rose, his wife's name was Rose, they honeymoon to Egypt because they're English and they're and he was an occultist weirdo, so of course that's where he wanted to go. And as they're knocking around Cairo, they're in a museum there, and they see this particular stele, which is a tablet with hieroglyphics on it. This particular stele that made quite an impression on him. And it led to an incident where, for several days during their honeymoon, Crowley's wife was becoming possessed by ancient Egyptian gods and coming forth with this new revelation, this new scripture, which became the Book of the Law. So at this point, Crowley takes everything he learned from the Golden Dawn, all the Golden Dawn materials he had, and remixes it and reinterprets it from the perspective of the new Aeon. So his view, Crowley's basic view, was that history is divided into these long ages called eons. It's eons with an A at the beginning. The first eon was matriarchal, right? And very lunar focused. Then at the dawn of civilization, so this is our hunter-gatherer period, society was very matriarchal, it was very lunar based. But then when agriculture comes along and the first cities come along and the first real priesthoods come along, we enter the so the first Aeon was the Aeon of Isis, right? The mother goddess. Then the second Aeon was the Aeon of Osiris, which was very solar, very patriarchal. All of the religions in the world at that time would have been considered, in Crowley's mind, were what he called Old Aeon. So they were the patriarchal Aeon of Osiris, the dying and resurrecting god. Crowley, the gist of the Book of the Law and the messages that he was receiving from his holy guardian angel, Aiwass, through his wife, and the ancient Egyptians' god, was that we were entering a new Aeon. That new Aeon would be the Aeon of the crowned and conquering child, the Aeon of Horus. And Crowley was the prophet of this new Aeon. And so Crowley founded at first an order that was a resurrection. After he remixed all of this, including a period where he ran around in the desert and took something that Mathers himself had never been able to figure out how to make workable, but he was the only guy who ever actually made it halfway understandable, which is Enochian magic. So Enochian magic comes to us from two Elizabethan gentlemen by the name of John Dee and Edward Kelly. John Dee was a spy. In fact, his personal code name for himself, when he wrote letters back to the Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council, was 007. That's where that comes from. He was a spy. He was a very learned man, professor, a doctor, legitimate scientist, that sort of thing, who also had probably the largest collection of occult books outside of the British Museum. In fact, the British Museum's collection of occult books began when Dee died. And still, like a third of the books in their collection were once owned by Dee, personally. Dee and Kelly was a scryer, con man, psychic, scryer, alchemist, thief, call him whatever you want. But they, for many years, were involved in this working where they were talking to the angels. And the reason it's called Enochian magic is because these angels identified themselves as the loyal angels. So not the Watchers from the Book of Enoch. They were the loyal angels. And one of the narratives of the Book of Enoch is these Watchers, Grigori, the fallen angels, came and taught mankind science and warfare and all of these technologies and agriculture. And what the angels revealed to Dee supposedly was that God always meant for mankind to know these things, but to know them at a certain time and in a certain way. And now, in the fullness of time, because of the holiness and piety of Dr. Dee, they were going to reveal the true science of God, the true sciences of God, to Dee, along with the language of the angels. So there's this whole language. And so this went on literally for decades, daily, often, channeling these angels and writing things down in these incredibly intricate, complicated ritual components that are difficult to understand under the best of circumstances because a lot of it was written down backwards, literally backwards, as is reflected in a mirror. Because D was a spy and he was concerned about secrecy. So he put codes and encrypted things and hid things. And to really make things rough, when D died, only 2 of the 3 volumes ever made it into the collection. The 3rd volume, the last one, disappeared. And nobody knows what happened to it. So it's incomplete. So Mathers is part of the Golden Dawn. This was like the last thing you learned in the Golden Dawn was Enochian magic, but there was no real magic to it. The closest he was ever able to get to it was an incredibly convoluted form of chess called Enochian chess, that he used as a form of divination, essentially, but weird. It was like divination and scrying, but I don't understand it. What Crowley and Neuberg were able to do, however, was they were actually able to turn it into a workable system. That is the subject of the book, The Vision and the Voice. And Crowley's working in The Vision and the Voice was how he, according to himself, was able to cross the abyss into the supernal triad of the Tree of Life. And that's why his reboot of the Golden Dawn has 3 orders, not 2. Because in the Golden Dawn, you had the lower order, which was the Golden Dawn proper, which was the bottom 4 spheres, so Malkuth and then the first triad. Then you would cross the veil into the middle triad, and you were an adept here. And then you had the abyss, and nobody could cross the abyss. It was impossible to cross the abyss since the fall because there was an 11th Sephira, Da'ath, which fell. And so now there's this gulf between the supernal triad where God lives and everything else. Crowley, through Enochian, believed that he found a way across. And so Crowley's reboot was called the AA overall, but the AA was also much like the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn overall was the name of their order, but it was also the name of the outer order. The inner order had a different name. Crowley's AA, the 3rd order, which I think there's less than a dozen people that have ever been a member of it. The idea is that people who would be member of the 3rd order would be essentially like continental heads. Like at most, there would only be 1 or 2 or 3 of them in the world at any given point in time. Now, after Crowley died, you had a lot of people just sort of call themselves Magister Templi. And then Crowley, of course, said there would only ever be 1 Magus, which is the 9th degree. There would only ever be 1 Magus in any given aeon, and it was him. And the purpose of the Magus was to pronounce the word of that aeon, literally 1 word that would define the spiritual reality of the aeon, and he chose the word thelema, which is Greek for will. So the AA had 3 orders. There was the GD, which is Golden Dawn, and it was exactly the Golden Dawn degrees. Then you had the middle order, which was still called the inner order, which he called the RR, which was just a shortening, or no, the RC for Rosy Cross, which was just a shortening of RR at AC, which was the Golden Dawn's version of it. And then the 3rd order was, and the name overall was AA, which nobody knows for certain, but it's pretty clear from Crowley's writings that it means Argentum Astrum, which is Latin for silver star, especially given that the the document that he wrote that lays out the degree structure and is the constitution of this order is called One Star in Sight. After his pronouncement in, I think, the Book of the Law, that every man and woman is a star. Because the Aeon of Horus is the first era was lunar, second era was solar. This third Aeon, this new Aeon, is the realm of the fixed stars, and it is the place where man becomes God. Crowley, in the AA, as he was reconstituting all this stuff from the Golden Dawn, and expanding upon it, brought two things in, neither of which he invented, but this was the first time they had come into mainstream Western esotericism, which is sex magic, both homosexual, heterosexual, and masturbatory. And then he also brought Eastern ideas into it. So this is the first time you find yoga and Tibetan practices, tantric practices. Not fully understood, but Crowley actually understood them a hell of a lot better because he'd actually been to Tibet, as opposed to sort of the main competitor at the time, not competitor, parallel at the time, which was the Theosophists, so Helena Blavatsky. But they don't have a system. I don't really talk about them because, much like how Wicca is a religion, it has magic as a part of it. Theosophy is pure occultism. There is no magic in it. There's nothing you do. You just sit around and you read books and you have lectures. That's it. There's nothing to do with it. So he's the guy. Crowley is the guy who really bridged East and West in Western occultism. Crowley then was approached by the head of another occult paramasonic German order known as the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, the Order of the Eastern Temple, which was again supposedly a successor of the Knights Templar. The head of this order came to him reportedly in a bit of a huff because he had just read one of Crowley's books. I think it was the Book of Lies, and was like, "Who told you our innermost secrets of our order?" And Crowley was like, "I don't know who the hell you are. What the hell are you talking about?" And basically, the guy on the spot proclaimed Crowley the head of the entire OTO globally. So the OTO is more Masonic, less magically oriented. The OTO is the specifically religious component of Thelema, whereas the AA is the specifically magical portion of it. The AA is very solitary, it's individual. Anyone who is in the AA is traditionally only supposed to know for certain two other members. And that's the one who's mentoring him and the one he's mentoring. Whereas the OTO is where like the Gnostic Mass comes in. There are degrees within the OTO that you are ordained as a deacon and then a priest and a bishop of the church, the Gnostic church that is part of the OTO. There's actually no rituals or instructions between the two orders. That there's no overlap between them. And originally, when Crowley was still around, the OTO was essentially a recruiting ground for the AA. That those who had the real talent for magic would be initiated into the mysteries of this secretive order, sort of inside the rest of it. Crowley, it's really difficult. Crowley's another one of those guys like Eliphas Levi, or the medieval people before them, which would probably be Agrippa would be the biggest one. Um, you can't overstate Crowley's impact. In the same way that there was really all of these guys, Eliphas Levi, Mathers, and Crowley, there is magic as it was before them, and there's magic as it was after them, but it affected everything. Um, Crowley, among the other ideas that he brought in, was he was the first guy that when he was talking about the Goetia, so demons, explicitly referred to them as heretofore unknown portions of the human brain. He should have said mind, but and in a lot of his writings in his magazine, The Equinox, um, the motto of which was the method of science, the aim of religion. So he was trying to create a spiritual science, according to himself. Um, that even in the midst of all of this magical talk and everything, when you got him down to brass tacks, he definitely seemed to be advocating more for a not purely psychological model of spiritualism and magic, but definitely more on that side. Like he was not very theistic at all. Um, Everything he did was a metaphor. All the spirits were metaphors, and he believed that all the gods, all the demons, all the everything, they lived in here. They lived inside each of us, and that magic was the process of learning how to deal with them. Another thing he did, idea he contributed, was because he grew up the son of a pastor in a very strict fundamentalist church at the time known as the Plymouth Brethren. Um, he was kind of allergic to anything that smacked of Christianity or the Christian God or the Jewish God. And so he set out to, as I mentioned talked about in the Lesser Pentagram Ritual class, um, he set about removing those things and then replacing them with Egyptian gods, Greek gods. Eventually, he replaced them with gods that he essentially made up, like Babylon, and the beast, which was his name for himself. You know, and in some of his writings, he gets perilously close to the notion of the thing that makes magic work and why it's so hard to prove it in a laboratory is that the person doing it has to believe it, or else it isn't going to work. If you just go through the motions and say the words, nothing's going to happen. You have to believe these things. You have to know them. And so a lot of people, including myself, tend to consider Aleister Crowley a proto-chaos magician, which we're just going to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that. Crowley died, so sad, after the war, and after World War II, and really after the war and even during the war, the OTO basically fell apart, so did the AA, because it was largely held together by Crowley. And there's Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard and all these weirdos in California were doing their thing, and then that piece of the OTO eventually became the whole OTO. So any OTO in the world is pretty much descended from that Agape Lodge now. But Crowley left behind. Crowley had many personal secretaries over the years. Two of the most important ones was Israel Regardie. So Israel Regardie basically was never oath bound into any of the orders, and so he was never under any restrictions to not talk about the things that Crowley was telling him. And documents that he was copying for Crowley and editing for Crowley and things like that. So Israel Regardie is notable for two main things. The first one is he took all of the documents of the Golden Dawn, all the rituals, the secret documents, the ritual documents, the instructions, all of it, and published it as a book known as the Golden Dawn. It's now in its fifth edition, and I tend to refer to it, I've heard others do it too, as the Big Black Brick, because the thing is like a telephone book. Um, I mean, it's bigger, it's as big as Crowley's magnum opus, Magic in Theory and Practice. Um, so that's Regardie. Regardie's the reason why we have the Golden Dawn stuff now. Um, and it's amazing because it became sort of the first open source magic, right? It it was everywhere. So now it could never die, and everybody took it and ran with it and did their own thing with it the same way Crowley did. One of Crowley's last, late in his life, secretaries was a man by the name of Kenneth Grant. And Kenneth Grant, Kenneth Grant really liked horror and he liked the spooky stuff. He was a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft. Um, he also became a big fan of mushrooms, magic mushrooms. And when those three things, those three currents in his life met in the 50s, um, Kenneth Grant combined the OTO with the OTO and AA, so this corpus of Western Golden Dawn style magic. He cross pollinated it with, as he himself said, acknowledged, the entirely fictitious Cthulhu mythos. Um, and his own readings and continued research into a subject that is almost entirely neglected in traditional Kabbalah and magical Kabbalah, which was the Qliphoth, the dark side of the Kabbalah, and combined those things and created an order known as the Typhonian OTO. And the Typhonian OTO was named after Typhon, which was this monster that was a dragon, and that he identified with Tiamat, and this very draconian reptilian tradition of Qliphothic magic that continues to this day through people like Bill Duvendak and Asenath Mason, and orders like the Dragon Rouge and the Temple of Ascending Flame. So Grant was the guy that basically brought the devil into it directly. You know, really big on Lilith, big on Satan, big on the bad guys, and the spooky stuff. Kenneth Grant had a friend, a good friend, who was an artist of a very mystical bent by the name of Austin Osman Spare. And the two of them, Spare was also a magician, but he did his own thing, and he had access. He was a student of Crowley's style of magic, Thelema, at the same time Grant was. They sort of came up together. Grant went sort of the spooky, dark way with it, and Spare was pretty dark too, and Crowley was pretty darn dark in places. I mean, the man legitimately believed he was the Antichrist. Uh, but Spare was far more visually oriented, and so Spare really, and Spare also, because he is a visual artist, and one of the things a lot of artists will tell you is art is constraint, right? Art is about, and this was the style at the time in the 50s and 60s, was really stripping things down, right? This is when we're at the point of abstract art, you know. where they're trying to strip down things to their bare essentials in terms of art. And he did the same thing to magic. And he sort of combined the two and came up with this an idea that he lifted from traditional Norse and Germanic magic of the bind rune, and came up with this idea, this method, by which you would write your intent down and cross out some of the letters and then mix them up and make a picture out of them. And that's sigil magic as we know it today, chaos style sigil magic, which predates chaos magic, right? But that was Spare, Kenneth Grant and Spare. So now you have sort of this forking in the road. You know, we started with Levi, we have Mathers and the Golden Dawn, Crowley and his stuff, and now we have a fork in the road, right? We have Grant on the left-hand side, and Spare considered himself a left-hand path magician too. So did all the early chaos magicians, but different angle, right? So you have this current has now split into two. We'll talk about the Grant side first. There's no direct connection between Grant and what came after him in that current. Although we're all using Grant's stuff. Pretty much no matter who you read, they're doing some remix of Kenneth Grant, or expansion on it, whether they know it or not, including me. I mean, I've never really read a lot of Grant. His books are, I mean, he's writing them on shrooms. They're hard to read. Grant, but then later, so this is the 1950s, this stuff is starting to percolate out. It's starting to percolate out. Some of it's even cross-pollinating with Scientology. Some of it's even cross-pollinating with a Scientology offshoot cult called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. All of this stuff is sort of coming together and coalescing in San Francisco. Because never forget, because of Jack Parsons, founder of JPL, was kind of head of the OTO for a long time. Pasadena and Northern California had a lot of this stuff going on, and already did for a long time. And then in the 60s, it kind of cross-pollinated with the hippie movement and everything else, and there was just all this weird stuff going on. And in the middle of this, a former carnival barker and crime scene photographer and just general knockabout con man, small-time con man, but also doing legitimate work, who was actually really good as a pretty good organ player, who lived and wrote under the assumed name of Anton Xander LaVey. In 1969, shaved his, on Walpurgisnacht, 1969, shaved his head and founded the Church of Satan. Now, Anton LaVey was an atheist, but that doesn't mean he wasn't spiritual. I mean, he was a hard atheist, but he believed in magic. His first book was the Satanic Bible. Second book was the Satanic Rituals. Both of those talk about magic. Now, he talks about them from purely a psychological perspective, and differentiates high magic versus low magic in the following way, which is low magic is the art and science of manipulating other people, right? Of pushing their buttons and getting them to do what you want, because he was a carnival barker. This is what he did. It was a combination of carnival barker, con man, confidence tricks, and he wrote his method down for doing all of these things. In his third book, which was The Satanic Witch. That was lesser magic. Greater magic was doing the same thing to yourself, right? So in his view, ritual magic was about creating a space in which you were giving your own psyche permission to change, right? That you were able to speak to your subconscious in a way that would cause subtle changes in your behavior and the behavior of people around you, and get you the things that you wanted in life and make you a better person. Um, and so the early Church of Satan, prior to 1975, I think, may have been 71, early 70s, was this very salon style thing where you had these really interesting people sort of bouncing ideas off of each other and creating this really interesting body of work. Problem was, there were two problems. One was people like that tend to get into arguments. If you've noticed a common theme in this, it's that magical orders always fall apart, right? Magical orders always fall apart because in order to be an effective magician, like we all talk about keeping the ego under control. The reason we talk about it so much is because we have to do it. And to be an effective magician, not even an effective magician, to even attempt magic ever, you have to have the kind of monstrous ego that says, I'm right and the entire fucking universe is wrong, right? And I'm gonna fix it, right? There's a reason why all of the old stories about magicians are cautionary tales about hubris and why magical orders blow up. They're strong personalities of strong-willed people, you know, people who have opinions and really strong opinions and like to argue about them. Like, I don't know if you've noticed the drama going on in our little corner of the community recently, but this is not a new thing. So, the inevitable occurred in the 70s, early 70s, and the Church of Satan blew up. And the rift basically came between, and it depends on who you ask. The rift from LaVey's side and the current Church of Satan, those who came after him, was that the other side were a bunch of superstitious weirdos who thought that magic was real, and so we kicked them out. The guy on the other side, who was a career Army psychological warfare officer by the name of Colonel Michael Aquino, basically said that Anton LaVey was using the Church of Satan as his private piggy bank, and it was rapidly becoming a fan club for him. A cult of personality built around him, and so they left and did their own thing, which was called the Temple of Set. I tend to believe Aquino's side, only because later, in the 80s, during the Satanic Panic, the FBI actually approached LaVey and like, we don't think you're involved in this, we don't think your people are involved in this, but can you give us some assistance in figuring out if anybody in your organization is responsible for any of this shit that's going on? And LaVey, it only recently became declassified. LaVey basically told the FBI agents, look, this whole thing is a scam. I'm doing it to get paid. Because, you know, I worked a lot of odd jobs for the first half of my life, and I don't know if you know this or not, they don't pay well. And San Francisco is really expensive, and so he had no savings. I don't fault him for it. You know, it literally turned into kind of a fan club, which is fine. He deserved a fan club. His writings were great, especially his later stuff. It's hilarious. And Aquino, the argument that they're supernaturalist, I think, is unfair. Because they have a very psychological model as well. Their psychological model in the Temple of Set, however, is more like ours. Like we're slightly more, most of us, in sort of this corner. Well, okay, me and DH basically are slightly more supernaturalist than Temple of Set, maybe, but not much. You know, for them, their magic is it's still about reprogramming yourself and reprogramming others. I mean, the dude was a psychological warfare officer, which is not as nearly an interesting job as you would think it is. Psychological warfare officer means they write propaganda. That's all that means. Um, so, Temple of Set's still around. Um, Aquino died a few years ago. It has gone through its own factions and splits since then and before then. Anton LaVey's own daughter ended up in the Temple of Set and then left the Temple of Set, and she's still around doing her own thing, which is kind of a weird satanic tantra thing that's actually pretty interesting. Xena LaVey. There were a shocking number of neo-Nazis in both groups that eventually got kicked out. And it was easy for them to hide because all through the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, man, did the Church of Satan and the Temple of Set love to get really as close to Nazi imagery as they possibly could. And they did it because LaVey certainly was not a Nazi. He was a gypsy. He was descendant of the Romani. There was no way. I mean, he probably had relatives that were sent to the camps. But the reason they did was for the same reason they appropriated Satan, right? Is we've appropriated the name Satan because it shocks normal people. Like the right kind of person, it attracts them. The wrong kind of person, it shocks them and pushes them away. And it's the same thing with the Nazi thing. It's like whoever the bad guys are in any point in history, that's who they're going to identify with. Not because they agree with them necessarily. But the problem is that they found out that no, there were a lot of guys for whom this was not just an aesthetic or a shtick. This was very real to them. And a lot of them got kicked out and ended up hooking up with a British satanic occult order that started in the 70s or 80s, known as the Order of the Nine Angles. And those guys were bad news. They literally organized themselves along terroristic cell lines, decentralized leadership lines. So much so that one of the founders of the order fake converted to Islam and joined Al-Qaeda for 5 years. And fought, like, in Iraq against British and American soldiers as a member of Al-Qaeda and a member of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then left and came back and brought that knowledge into the O9A. So many American Nazis, neo-Nazis, and Nazi sympathizers, and just straight up assholes, and people for whom, frankly, Church of Satan and Temple of Set weren't edgy enough. Because remember, the O9A basically, it gets overstated. O9A does believe in human sacrifice. However, what they believe in is becoming a police officer or a soldier so you can legally kill people. Or at least don't get caught. They are completely antinomian. And they took, like, Kenneth Grant got pretty out there with some of his writings. And literally what they did was they took Kenneth Grant's writings and essentially took any sense of propriety or decency out of it. Like the O9A's core belief is that good is evil and that humanity is awful, and that in order to be a god, you have to kill everything inside you that is decent and good and feels compassion for anybody or anything. You have to force yourself to become a sociopath. And they've done a lot of horrible things, including this Daniel Hussein kid who fell in with them because there is no membership. That's why all the arguing over whether or not EA was ever a member of the O9A is silly. There is no membership. It's not like you fill out an application and sign a card. You're a member if you say you're a member. You know, and it's kind of run like a gang, which is if you claim to be a certain degree of member, um, they're gonna come test you, and by test you, try to kill you. But so many of these assholes and rabble that fell away from the Church of Satan and Temple of Set ended up hooking up with the O9A in the 80s. That eventually they formed their own whole branch of the O9A called the Temple of Blood. Um, Temple of Blood had eventually subverted and took over a neo-Nazi group known as Atomwaffen, um, and they're causing major problems. That's what got EA into trouble. Atomwaffen got noticed by the three-letter agencies, by the FBI, and that put anyone and anything that had ever been associated, even sideways, with the Temple of Blood or the O9A, that put them on everybody's radar. Now Michael W. Ford is too, but I think I'm gonna make sure I say this the right way because it's gonna sound like a bust on EA and it's not. Um, Michael Ford was very smart in that very early on in his career, he publicly repudiated the O9A and was very careful to explain that yes, he got some useful things from it, but that the good is far outweighed by the bad, and has been very open about it over the years. Whereas I'm not even going to say it. I'm not going to criticize EA at all because I don't know. I'm not the guy who was making the decisions. I'm just saying that if I was in that position, um, I would be talking. I would be more open about the terrible things that they did. But anyway, whatever. Um, so that's sort of up through today, um, of sort of the spooky side, the side in which most of us find ourselves. Um, the other side, Spare, the eventually the works of Spare. This magical thing happened at Oxford and Cambridge universities in the late 70s. The same time punk happened. Um, which was these really smart guys who were all of the same kind of mindset. Peter J. Carroll, Sherwin, um, Chapman, this cavalcade of characters all happened to sort of know each other and run in the same circles, centered around this occult bookshop right off campus that had really good coffee, and that's the only reason they ended up there. But then they started reading the books and like, this is interesting. And Peter J. Carroll was an astrophysics major, and Sherwin was whatever major, and they traded ideas and cross-pollinated, and it's in the midst of this punk thing where it's all very do-it-yourself and strip things down to the bare essentials, and zine culture, and early hacker culture and all this stuff. And they all started, and they, including Spare, this bookshop had copies of Spare's books, and they all really kind of liked Spare's idea of how he did that sigil magic thing. But then they all went their own directions with it. And broadly, that's chaos magic, but there is a narrower definition of chaos magic, and that's Peter J. Carroll specifically. So A lot of those guys wrote books. That's how we know them. And they're really good books, but they're not what Carroll's writing was. Um, Carroll had a certain kind of mind. Carroll is also, by all accounts, a raging asshole. Um, as are a great many of the great magicians. But Peter J. Carroll wrote, so in the same way that Eliphas Levi, in 1854, completely upset the apple cart of magic with his book, um, Pete Carroll did the same thing with Liber Null. And Liber Null was the first, like, serious book on chaos magic. He went on to write, I think, 5 more books. It depends on how you count them, because, like, if you buy Liber Null now, it actually includes his second book, which was Psychonaut. It's just a collection of essays. All of them are fantastic. I've read all of them. They get progressively more difficult to understand as you go, because his major was astrophysics. And I only understood about half the math in the last book, because he's getting to that point where he is defining theories of magic as physical equations. So Liber Null and the stuff that came around with it, but Liber Null really establishes this idea that the fundamental thing that makes magic work is your belief in it, right? And as long as you believe it'll work, you can make almost anything work, right? And in their day, they did this by, this week, literally, there's an exercise in one of Pete's books about, you have 5, in one of his books, he defines sort of 5 different basic worldviews of reality, from like theism, atheism, yada, yada, yada. And for the exercise is, for a month, you were supposed to roll a 6-sided die every morning, and then whatever side comes up, that's what you believe today. And you have to believe it. You can't just go through the motions. You have to keep doing it until you believe it. The key to which is fake it until you make it, or act as if it were true. And if you keep doing that, eventually you'll find that you actually believe that it's true. And then if it came up, I think, a 1, it was dealer's choice. You could pick what you wanted. And like, if theism came up, like, it was different versions of theism that you were supposed to pick. Like, I'm going to be a Greek pagan. I'm going to be a polytheist today. I'm going to be a pantheist this other day. To experiment with this idea of, when I am about to do magic, I am going to step into this paradigm and immerse myself in it and believe it for as long as I need to make it work. And then I'm going to step back from it and evaluate my results. Because again, this is not a criticism. Like DH's video on criticism of results-oriented magic. I readily admit that what he's busting against, I hate too. And that's unfortunately what results-oriented magic means in the vast majority of people's heads. That is not what Pete Carroll and that first generation of chaos magicians meant about results-oriented. What they meant by results-oriented was the result is the only thing that you can use to judge a ritual. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And so that's where you get the 3 rules from that I harp about all the time, which is, if the only 3 things you need to do to be a magician are: 1, read everything you can get your hands on; Two, as you're reading these books, anytime you run into something that looks like something you think you could manage, do it. Three, write it down. And then stick with the stuff that works. Because Pete's a scientist, right? You do the experiment, you get the result. You publish a paper, other people repeat the experiment and see if they get the same result. It's just that the difference between science and magic is you don't have to believe in science for it to work. Magic, you have to believe in it or it won't work. And specifically what Pete doesn't see a hard distinction between those two things. He sees them as a continuum. And one of the wisest things, I think, many of the wisest things I think were ever said, were said by Pete Carroll in one of his books. And one of them is that science is the magic of the probable and predictable. Magic is the science of the improbable, right? It's the thing, like science is about flipping a coin 100 times and seeing how many times it comes up heads or tails. Magic is about flipping a coin and seeing if you can get it to land on its edge. Right? It's the 1 in a million shot. And his view of how magic works is that it gooses the odds. Right? It fiddles with the initial conditions of things. Which is why especially in Carroll's version of chaos magic, the further out in time and space, so the further away something is from you, the easier it is to change. As opposed to, like, if I need $100 tomorrow, I'm in trouble. If I need $100 a month from now, that's something I can work with. And this comes to the most important thing about chaos magic. The chaos in chaos magic is not talking about randomness, right? They do talk about that, but especially Peter Carroll uses the term stochastic magic because that's the right word for it. Because stochast is a Greek word for like casting lots, randomness, right? Chaos is also, they use the word in the terms of the primordial void of manifestation, because one of the ideas is that you are reaching into sort of the initial state of the universe and adjusting the parameters a little bit. It's chaos as in chaos theory, the idea that a butterfly can flap its wings in Africa and create a hurricane in Florida. That that reality, all of reality, is a system that runs iteratively on a loop. And such systems, there's a feedback loop built into everything. And so if you can adjust the initial conditions just a little bit, you can create these huge changes down the road. And also, you'd never be able to prove in front of a laboratory that you did anything, you know. But so Pete wrote Liber Null and Psychonaut, and it was a big deal. And it very quickly led to the formation of a semi-formalized order, actually a formal order, called the Illuminates of Thanateros, the IoT. They began having a series of annual meetings in the late 80s. And then in 1990, the second most important name in chaos magic behind Peter Carroll, which is a German guy whose pen name is Frater UD, and just about anybody who does chaos magic has read at least one of his books. Frater UD and Peter Carroll got into some sort of argument. Both of them tell the story completely differently. Peter J. Carroll says Frater UD is a Nazi. Frater UD says Peter Carroll is paranoid and a weirdo. And essentially, the IoT split. All of the German speaking members of the IoT basically left. And off they went and did their own things. Peter Carroll was so pissed off. And North America generally stayed loyal to Pete for a while, but then they got pissed off at him and then sort of went off and did their own thing. And the UK barely managed, the UK section of the IoT barely managed to hold it, because Pete's from the UK, barely managed to hold itself together for another couple of years, until things finally calmed down, and Peter J. Carroll in 1992 publicly repudiated the IoT and left. It still exists. Really, the only section that still exists is the North American section, but it's not what it used to be. And that's when Pete published his actual second book, which is Liber Chaos, which, if you only read 2 books on chaos magic, make it Liber Null and Liber Chaos. The problem with Liber Null is you're going to go through it and think there's really not much in terms of here of practical exercises. That's because they're all in Liber Chaos. Because Liber Chaos was essentially, the idea of Liber Null was to give you enough and to give you the theory, and then to offer you the opportunity to come to the IoT and learn the how. Like, this is the why that magic works. Now come learn the how. And then when he left, he took all of that, organized it into a book, and just released it as, here's the how. And the other books are all really good too, but those Liber Null and Liber Chaos are Chaos with a K, Kaos, are both really good. And that brings us to 92. Which is where I was going to leave off. Because after 92, the internet started to become a big thing. And even in the early days of the internet, chaos magic especially was heavily embedded in hacker culture. And the internet caused, so that the confluence, essentially what happened after 1992 is all of those previous threads and currents, right, that we've had since Eliphas Levi over the last 150 years, really at the turn of the century. All of those different currents hit the internet, and it started cross-pollinating. And so now, where we are now is, I would argue, we are in the postmodern magical era, which postmodern magic is, let's just say that I think, like, Peter Carroll never said this, but he just certainly had the idea of it, and so did Frater UD, that everyone's a chaos magician whether they acknowledge it or not. Like, I'm still a chaos magician. I just have a paradigm that I'm really happy with, and I'm probably not going to walk out of it anytime soon. You know? So all of those threads with the internet. So we are in a place where magic is very eclectic. We're able to do stuff like this, you know, that we wouldn't have been able to do even, 10 years ago? Nobody was doing this. People were having flame wars on internet forums. But, and yeah, there's whole bodies of really good magical writing that exist entirely as alt magic posts from back in the good old days of Usenet. Um, one of the things that it's hit me myself is at a certain point, because Reddit occult circles became such a cesspool. I deleted my account and realized, oh my God, there were ritual documents and magical documents that I had written essentially that are now gone forever. And somebody like Billy Brujo, who had this really amazing channel, and for whatever reason he just pulled the plug one day and deleted all of it. The ephemeral nature of this stuff is what scares me. Like EA's channel getting banned, and the fact that there's a lot of those videos that he has those were the only copies, were the ones that were on YouTube, and if YouTube isn't willing to bring them up out of the backup tapes, they're never going to be seen again. This class and the one I taught last week, because of the size of these files compared to the size of my hard drive, and I haven't bought an external for them yet. And even then, hard drives fail. That's my day job, is worrying about these things. The ephemeral nature of this shit is what bothers me, which is why future generations will thank you. Like, I'm the guy who normally says, like, no, fuck writing shit down. Like, actually writing it down on paper. Anything you're doing with magic, write that shit down. Write it down physically. Because then you don't have to worry about the internet crashing and losing it. Like unimportant shit like electricity and civilization and agriculture, those can get deleted. I don't care about that. The stuff we're doing is important. 99.999% of it is utter and complete shit, but if there's one theme of this class, it is that 99.999% of everything everybody does, not just in magic, but in everything, but especially magic, is shit. It's crap. But all it takes is for one person with the right mindset and the right abilities to have the right idea. And one book can change the world. Right? And I would cite this as one of the proofs both of the effectiveness of magic and of chaos magic in particular, is that ability of one person to have this massively outsized effect on the world really only happens in magic, right? More than any other discipline, except maybe like professional athletes. But even then, like LeBron can say shit, but it's not like he can really change things, whereas you get the right magic, you get the right piece of inspiration at the right time, and you can change everything for yourself and for everybody else too. So yeah, I think that's where we're gonna leave off. I'm about 90 minutes. Yeah, that's not too bad. The audio for questions didn't pick up last time, but if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. I'm gonna have to repeat them.
That was great. Only thing I would wonder is what year did the Rosicrucians start, and then what year did they end?
Okay, so okay, Rosicrucian is pre-modern. Rosicrucianism is to the Renaissance what Golden Dawn was to modern magic. Let's put it that way. And very similar story, which is in 16th century, I think, might be 15th. but 16th century. So Germany, these documents showed up, these books showed up purporting to be released by this ancient magical order of alchemists, who were decided it was now time to reveal themselves to the world, yada yada yada. In reality, nobody knows who the hell wrote them. Actually, it had to be 16th century because the printing press existed. That's the big thing. So if you want to know when, so maybe this might be the next topic, and I might do this next week. If we want to roll this, like if we want to do this as a follow up, and that might not be a bad one to talk about the Renaissance. The printing press. Printing press had a huge effect. That's where the grimoire tradition comes from. So, like, all those books that supposedly were written by Solomon, some of them existed in some form beforehand, but the vast majority of them were invented out of whole cloth when the printing press came along. For the same reason that a lot of the shit we do now, EA exists because of the internet. You know, the printing press came along, and this new profession of author came along, and people saw an opportunity to make money selling books. And some of them are good, some of them are terrible, but that's why I get so uppity when people say things like, you can't use the Simon Necronomicon because some guy just made that up. I'm like, you say that like the Lemegeton wasn't some guy just making it up. You know, even if that guy was King Solomon, like, fuck it. I'll even let you go that far with the legend that King Solomon actually put pen to paper and wrote every one of these words. He still sat down and made it up. Right?
Yeah, that's kind of a thing, though, in magic is no one knows.
Right. And that's the beauty of it, is that the Simon Necronomicon is another one of those really important proofs of chaos magic, which is you have to be able to hold in your head the two fundamental facts about the Simon Necronomicon, which is Peter Lavenda made it up kind of as a joke and kind of as a scam. And two, 40, 50 years of people have been using this book and getting not just results, but legendarily, like, oh my god, I burned the house down results. Like, this is one of the most horrifying books out there that people play with, and shit goes wrong. And Lavenda made it up as a joke by like, just picking random shit from what he knew from Sumerian and Babylonian magic. You know? It's fake, but it works. Those are two really, really important things. And if you want to understand magic, I suggest anyone watching this video at any point in time, let your first lesson be, sit down and think about those two facts. So yeah, maybe we'll do Renaissance next week. I don't know. I kind of feel like maybe I want to do something a little more practical. Maybe do something that's a little more interactive, because my voice is completely blown the fuck out now. But like more of a discussion oriented thing. I don't know. We'll see. But
Whatever you feel like.
yep. So good night to you, and good night to everybody watching later. And I'm gonna put together some notes, including, I almost forgot to mention her. There is a YouTube channel from a professor named Dr. Angela Puka that is all about the history of magic, and she's a cultural anthropologist who studies magic. And her last set of videos was all about that. Pete Carroll was all about chaos magic and the ice magic wars and everything that happened. But she talks about Grant, she talks about Crowley, she talks about the Golden Dawn, everything. And in really short, to the point, digestible videos. So I'm definitely going to put a link to her channel down in the notes. And Yeah, I think that's probably going to be the only source document I have. Although I'll see if I can find a public domain version of Waite's um, ritual and dogma and ritual of, or transcendental magic, whatever he called it, Eliphas Levi. I just call it by the source name. At a certain point, a book is so famous you just call it by the author's last name, Levi. You know. Yeah, and really, if you want more info, just read everything Crowley ever wrote. That won't take you long. Um, like it's only just the Equinox. Like it was a magazine that was hardbound, and each issue was like 300 pages. So
Okay.
yeah, it was a monthly, but it was not like a little flimsy magazine. Um, so yeah. All right. So this will probably hit YouTube tomorrow sometime.
Cool. Hail.
Bye, everybody.